Margaret Hayes never imagined her quiet life in Vermont would shift so suddenly. At 61, she moved through her days with a soft routine that made her feel safe watering her garden in the early morning, wiping dust off the wooden shelves in her cozy living room, and sitting by the window with a cup of warm tea as she read stories that reminded her of emotions she had tucked away years ago. After losing her husband, she learned how to fill her home with calm silence, convincing herself that stillness was enough. Her daughter Emily lived 2 towns away with her husband Daniel. They had been married for 5 years, and Margaret considered Daniel one of the most respectful men she had ever met. He wasn't loud or overly charming, but he had a steady way of speaking that made people trust him. He always carried boxes for her without being asked. He fixed her mailbox after a storm. He brought her flowers on Mother's Day without fail. He treated her like family from the first day they met. So when Emily shared that she had to travel to Toronto for a week-long work seminar, Margaret simply smiled and wished her luck. It felt like something ordinary people traveled for work all the time. There was no reason to expect anything unusual, but everything changed on the second evening of Emily's trip. Margaret was preparing a simple dinner, vegetable soup and buttered bread, when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number at first, but when she answered, she heard a voice she knew well, except it sounded nothing like usual. "Mom, it's me." Daniel's voice was heavy, quiet, almost trembling. Margaret paused with a spoon in her hand. "Daniel, is something wrong?" There was a longer pause than she expected, the kind that makes the heart tighten a little. It wasn't like him to sound unsure. She heard him take a slow breath, as if he was struggling to find the right words. "I don't want to worry you," he said, "but I've been feeling off. I just didn't know who else to call." She placed the spoon down and leaned on the counter. He had never sounded vulnerable before, and she didn't know how to respond immediately. Daniel was always the one who held things together, the one who comforted, never the one who needed comforting. "Talk to me," she said softly. "I don't want to be alone this week," he finally admitted. "Emily's gone and the house feels too quiet. Could you come stay for a few days? I know it's a lot to ask, but I need someone here." The request struck her as odd, but not inappropriate. He wasn't asking for anything strange. He didn't sound suspicious or demanding. He sounded sad, like someone balancing too many emotions on a thin line. Margaret hesitated only a moment before agreeing. She couldn't ignore someone who sounded like they were breaking inside. "I'll come tomorrow morning," she said gently. "I'll bring some things and help around the house." Daniel let out a breath she hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you, Mom. Really?" When the call ended, Margaret stood in the kitchen for a long moment, thinking. It wasn't wrong to help family. It wasn't unusual to support someone who felt lonely. But something about the tone of his voice stayed with her, soft, uncertain, almost frightened. She wondered if something deeper was happening, something he wasn't ready to say yet. The next morning, the sky was gray and heavy. Clouds stretched low across the horizon as if reflecting Daniel's mood. Margaret packed a small overnight bag, reminding herself that she was going to help, nothing more. Still, an unexpected nervousness tugged at her chest. She told herself it was only worry for Daniel, not anything else. When she arrived at the house, she was surprised by how quiet everything seemed. Daniel opened the door slowly. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept. His eyes were slightly red, his posture slumped. But he still managed a weak smile. "Thank you for coming," he said. Margaret stepped inside, noticing how neat the house was. Nothing seemed out of place, which made Daniel's emotional state even more confusing. Usually, people who were overwhelmed left traces: messy counters, forgotten dishes, clothes scattered around. But everything here was as immaculate as Emily usually kept it. "You look tired," Margaret said gently. "Are you feeling sick?" Daniel shook his head. "No, just everything caught up with me this week." She waited for him to continue, but he didn't. Instead, he gestured toward the living room. "Sit down, please. There's something I need to tell you." Margaret's heart tightened again. Those words always carried weight. She sat on the edge of the sofa waiting, not wanting to push him. Daniel remained standing for a moment, rubbing the back of his neck the way people do when they're trying to gather courage. He looked younger suddenly, stripped of the confidence he usually had. "I didn't ask you here for anything strange," he began. "I know the request sounded odd, but the truth is, I've been carrying something for a long time." Margaret nodded slowly. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." Daniel sat down across from her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He looked down at the floor, then up at her, then away again. She could feel his emotional weight from where she sat. "I feel lost," he said finally. "Ever since my father passed away last year, I've been on autopilot. I kept telling myself I was fine, that I was strong enough to handle everything. And for a while, I convinced everyone, including myself." Margaret felt a deep ache in her chest. She remembered Daniel's father's funeral, how quiet Daniel had been. How he stood next to Emily and accepted everyone's condolences without showing a crack. "But I wasn't okay," he continued. "I kept trying to be the man everyone thinks I am. The strong one. The calm one. The one who never breaks. But when Emily left for this trip, it hit me how empty the house felt. How empty I felt." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. "Daniel, you should have told someone sooner." He shook his head. "I didn't want to burden Emily. She works so hard and she's been stressed about her job. And I didn't want her to think I wasn't supporting her." He paused, taking another breath. "I called you because you're the only person who has ever made me feel safe when I'm like this." Margaret felt the words settle inside her. They weren't romantic, not inappropriate, but they carried a deep emotional truth she wasn't expecting. She cared for Daniel, always had. But hearing that she was the one he felt safe with stirred. Something she couldn't name. She pushed the feeling aside. "You're not a burden," she said gently. "You're human. You're allowed to need help." Daniel nodded slowly, as if her words gave him permission to soften his shoulders. They spent the next hour talking. Margaret asked questions carefully, not wanting to push him too far, but wanting to understand. Daniel talked about responsibilities, expectations, the constant pressure to appear strong. He admitted he hadn't shared these feelings with anyone, not even Emily, because he didn't want to seem weak. "I know it sounds strange," he said, "but having you here, it makes everything feel lighter. Like I don't have to pretend." Margaret felt her chest tighten again, but this time with empathy. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said. "You're family." Daniel looked at her, then really looked. His eyes were soft, grateful, full of emotions he didn't know how to name. He wasn't hinting at anything inappropriate. He was simply someone who had been carrying too much for too long. The moment stretched between them, quiet and warm, and then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. A loud rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, and rain began tapping against the windows. The house felt smaller suddenly, more intimate in a way Margaret couldn't quite explain. She felt something stirring inside her, a mix of concern, protectiveness, and a strange tenderness she tried to brush away. Daniel stood and poured her a cup of tea, his hand steady now, his voice calmer. They talked about small things, the weather, Emily's trip, the repairs he planned to make around the house. But beneath every word there was an unspoken truth. Something had changed between them. Not in a romantic or forbidden way, but in a deeply emotional one. A connection that wasn't planned and wasn't simple. And just when Margaret thought the evening had settled, Daniel looked at her again with that softened expression. "There's more I need to tell you," he said quietly. "Something I've never said out loud." Margaret's breath caught. "What is it, Daniel?" He hesitated, conflicted, eyes filled with a truth he wasn't sure he should reveal. And in that suspended moment, standing between confession and silence, Margaret felt her heart brace for something she wasn't prepared to hear. Margaret sat quietly across from Daniel, her hands resting on her lap. The storm outside rumbled softly, rain tapping against the windows. Inside the house, the air felt charged with an intensity she hadn't expected. Daniel's eyes held something that was both vulnerable and heavy, and Margaret realized she had never seen him like this before. He had always been composed, polite, and responsible, the kind of man who appeared steady even under pressure. Yet now, sitting in her presence, he seemed raw, open, and human in a way that both startled and moved her. "I've never told anyone this," he began, his voice low and steady but trembling slightly at the edges. "Not Emily, not my friends. No one." He paused, struggling to find the words, as if speaking them aloud made the feelings more real. "I've been carrying so much inside me, pressure, expectations, responsibilities. I thought I could handle it alone, but I can't. Sometimes it feels like I'm drowning. I don't know how to breathe." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She had always been a good listener, but she hadn't realized until now how much Daniel needed someone who would truly hear him. He was asking for nothing more than presence, and yet the intensity of his need was palpable. She leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact, offering silent encouragement. "You don't have to face it alone, Daniel," she said softly. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." His shoulders relaxed fractionally, and he exhaled slowly. Margaret noticed the way his hands trembled just a little as they rested on the table. He was unguarded, and there was something profoundly moving about witnessing this part of him that no one else had seen. "Emily thinks I'm strong," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "She relies on me. Everyone does. And for a while I thought if I admitted I wasn't strong, if I admitted I needed help, I would let everyone down. But this week, with Emily gone, I realized I can't keep pretending. I can't keep hiding." Margaret's heart ached for him. She remembered moments from her own life when she had felt the same weight on the chest, a loneliness that no one could see. She understood the fear of being judged for needing help, the terror of revealing vulnerability in a world that often demanded strength. "You're not letting anyone down," she said gently. "Acknowledging your feelings doesn't change who you are. It doesn't change how much Emily loves you. It doesn't change anything except giving you permission to be yourself." Daniel nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I didn't call you here because I wanted someone to fix things for me," he admitted. "I called because I needed someone who would just listen. Someone who wouldn't judge me. Someone who could remind me that I'm not alone." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. His words were honest and simple, yet they carried a depth of emotion that made her feel connected to him in a way that went beyond the usual mother-in-law relationship. There was no inappropriate request, no hidden agenda, just raw human need and a willingness to be vulnerable. "You're not alone, Daniel," she said, reaching out to gently place her hand on the table near his. He glanced at it, then at her, and a quiet sense of relief passed over his face. It was not a touch of intimacy or desire, just reassurance. A bridge across a difficult emotional moment. The storm outside intensified, but inside, the house felt safe. They talked for hours. Margaret listened as he spoke about the pressures of his job, the expectations he felt at home, the quiet loneliness he had experienced in moments when he thought no one noticed. Every story he shared revealed a man who had been carrying burdens silently, a man who was deeply caring and conscientious, but had never allowed himself the luxury of admitting fear or weakness. Margaret responded with empathy and encouragement. She shared small anecdotes from her own life, about the times she had felt isolated after her husband passed, about the moments she had wished for someone to simply sit and listen. The conversation was gentle and unhurried, yet it flowed quickly because each word mattered. There was no repetition, no need to fill silence. The silence itself was comfortable, an unspoken understanding passing between them. As the evening wore on, Daniel grew more relaxed. He laughed softly at memories of Emily's childhood antics, shared stories from work that had always frustrated him but now felt lighter as he voiced them aloud, and even admitted small fears about his own future that he had kept to himself. Margaret remained a quiet anchor, offering nods, words of reassurance, and the occasional smile that conveyed empathy without judgment. By the time dinner was ready, a calm had settled over both of them. Margaret cooked a simple meal: roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, and mashed potatoes. Daniel set the table carefully, his movements steady and deliberate. They ate together, talking about mundane things: the weather, the garden Margaret tended in her spare time, the new cafe Emily had discovered downtown. The ordinary rhythm of a shared meal provided comfort, grounding their connection in normalcy, even as deeper emotions lingered just beneath the surface. After dinner, they cleared the dishes together, working side by side in quiet harmony. The storm had softened to a gentle drizzle, and through the window, the night sky was dark but calm. Daniel paused by the sink, leaning slightly against the counter. "Margaret," he said, his voice soft, "I don't know how to thank you. Just having you here. It's more than I can say. I didn't know I could feel this understood." Margaret shook her head gently. "You don't need to thank me. I'm here because I care. That's all the reason anyone should need." For a moment, they stood in silence, the rain outside providing a quiet soundtrack to a moment filled with understanding and mutual respect. Daniel's expression was open, relieved, and deeply human. Margaret realized that this was the kind of bond that transcended ordinary labels. It wasn't romance. It wasn't family obligation. It was a profound emotional connection, a shared recognition of vulnerability and care. Later, as they settled in the living room with cups of tea, Margaret reflected on the week. She thought about how easily life could slip into routines that masked loneliness and unspoken fears. Daniel's presence reminded her that even people who seemed strong could need someone to lean on. She had always prided herself on being independent and self-sufficient. But this week had shown her that emotional closeness, even with someone she wasn't romantically involved with, was life-affirming. It reminded her that care and empathy could create bonds just as meaningful as love. When Emily returned home 2 days later, she found the house in perfect order. Margaret was in the kitchen arranging flowers, while Daniel greeted her with a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before. He hugged Emily tightly, laughing softly at a joke she made about the traffic on her trip. Margaret watched the scene, feeling both joy and a gentle pang of wistfulness. She had been a quiet presence, a source of strength, and the week had changed them, while Daniel had been healed in small but meaningful ways. Emily had returned to a more relaxed household, and Margaret herself had rediscovered a sense of purpose that went beyond daily routines. Later, the house grew quiet again. Margaret sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the week. She realized that the experience had left an indelible mark on her. She hadn't crossed any boundaries, hadn't acted on feelings that could complicate relationships, but she had offered something rare: true emotional presence. And in doing so, she had reminded herself of the power of listening, the importance of empathy, and the quiet strength that comes from being there for someone who needs you. In the days that followed, life returned to its usual rhythm. Margaret tended her garden, read her novels, and continued her quiet routines. But she carried with her the memory of that week, the vulnerability she had witnessed, the trust Daniel had placed in her, and the emotional connection they had shared. It was a delicate balance, one that required careful thought and respect. And she knew that the bond they had formed would remain as a quiet, meaningful presence in their lives. Margaret often thought about Daniel's words, about the way he had trusted her when he felt exposed. And she realized that human connection could take many forms. Not all relationships were defined by romance or obligation. Some were defined by understanding, empathy, and the willingness to meet someone in the fullness of their humanity. She had offered comfort without expectation, and in return, she had found a renewed sense of purpose and emotional satisfaction. And so, the week that began with a simple request ended with lessons that neither Margaret nor Daniel could have predicted. They had discovered the power of listening, the depth of human vulnerability, and the quiet beauty of emotional closeness. It was a story that didn't need a dramatic ending or a romantic twist. Its power lay in the everyday moments of care, the unspoken understanding, and the respect for boundaries that kept their relationship both meaningful and appropriate. Margaret Hayes had entered Daniel's home as a mother-in-law, offering help. She left as someone who had reminded a man of his humanity in doing so. had found herself touched by the grace of empathy and emotional honesty. Life continued, predictable and quiet, yet beneath its surface. Both had changed in ways that were lasting, subtle, and profoundly human.